Okay, right, yeah. So the topic, Indyref 2, and what position Marxists should take in that. And I was stating that I think the obvious position to take is that the Scottish people have the right to have a referendum on independence if they so desire. And any attempt by Westminster to veto such a referendum would be anti-democratic and would be an infringement of the right to national self-determination. Johnston has stated, over the last few months that Westminster wouldn't grant such a referendum, but he's been contradicted by Gove recently, and certainly the Scottish Tories and some of the old guard do suggest that if the Scottish Parliament requested a referendum, such a referendum would have to take place. Now, at the moment, Sturgeon's saying that any referendum wouldn't be till the end of 2022. So it's still some way off before the Scottish Parliament would be taking a vote on it and then putting down an official request, from my understanding. As I say, the Socialist position should be fairly clear. If the Scottish Parliament, representing the Scottish people, say that they want to have an Indyref 2, there should be no block put on that. So, basically that's the answer from my point of view to the first question that's been posed. Obviously, from my position, someone who defends working class unity against the capitalist class, and you can hear me okay? Hello?
Yeah, it's fine.
Right, fine. I'll just continue on then. And if you can't hear me, if someone could maybe interrupt and say, you're not being heard. But the position for Socialists should be quite clear that we do state that if the Scottish Parliament votes for an Indyref 2, it must take place. I personally think that there's no way that the British ruling class will try and block such a referendum if the Scottish Parliament votes for it. I think it would be raising the stakes, particularly at a time when the support for Scottish independence has been dropping in the polls. And there's numerous obstacles now in front of Scottish independence compared with, say, 2014, when the last referendum took place. One of the main ones being Brexit, obviously, because it would be suggested you would have a hard border with England. From the nationalist point of view, the other problem is the split with Salmond, etc., and the formation of the New Alba Party. And also, many people in the Scottish nationalist movement suspect that the leadership of the SNP are actually very hesitant about calling an Indyref 2, because they really don't have any white paper as they did in 2014 with an economic perspective. They don't have anything to put forward to the Scottish people, nothing worked out other than vague promises and a continuation of neoliberalism. So I think there's a wee bit of bluffing going on both sides, but I think the socialist position is clear. We support the right of Scotland to have an independence referendum if they so wish. Now, in terms of the politics I think socialists should put forward, I think we should oppose the independence project in the name of defending and promoting working class unity against the capitalist class. I mean, there's no doubt that the British working class exists as a social reality. You can't understand British society over the last 150 years without understanding that the British working class has formed itself and does exercise an influence in British society. And there's always been an understanding on the left anyhow that what we're striving for is to get a workers' government that would represent the interests of the working class in Britain, linked into an international movement. And if you look at the gains the working class have made over the last 100 years in terms of democratic rights, in terms of a welfare state, etc., you have a situation that's been achieved by the struggles of the British working class in Britain, combined obviously with the struggles of the international working class, because a lot of the democratic reforms really followed on from the capitalist class losing power in Russia and the attempt to forestall the development of socialism in the rest of the planet. But my point on this is the British working class exists, and we need to have a party that represents the working class, and we need to have a programme that represents the interests of the working class, and that Scottish independence, and it is actually, you know, obviously an independent capitalist Scotland that is being talked about, that is a diversion and a dead end for the working class, and it's something that socialists should oppose. And it's a great disappointment and tragedy that so much of the left in Scotland have ended up simply being the left face of the SNP and building that type of movement. I mean, if you look at the rise of the SNP, I mean, we see it, and its origins are really on the right, formed in the 20s. He got nowhere for years and years, again, very much on the right. Some of the leadership jailed during the Second War for being sympathetic to fascism. And you move up to the 60s when, with the discovery of oil, you start to get a development and support for the idea that with the oil, Scotland could be independent. It could break away from all the class struggle strife that was taking place in Britain in the 60s and 70s. And therefore, a section of the Scottish establishment moved towards supporting Scottish independence. It's always, in my opinion, been a right-wing movement. Obviously, it has to present itself on certain occasions as being in the interests of ordinary people. Otherwise, it wouldn't get any support. But when you look at the 14 years of the Scottish government in office, you can see, you know, austerity, cuts, anti-democratic measures, very obviously a movement that is not one, a socialist movement or a movement towards the interests of the working class, very much a movement of the Scottish establishment, and one that now is very well situated in Scotland in terms of the careers it can provide to professional politicians, etc. I think amongst the base of the SNP support, there is a kind of cynicism that really the SNP now isn't fighting for independence. It's more or less an organisation that's providing well-paid jobs to its top echelons. And that is part of the reason that we have to see the fight and the fallout with Salmon and the trial, etc. That is the fight for positions and different cliques within it. And there is a suspicion that the SNP are not keen, particularly under Sturgeon, to actually fight for independence, because they know that at the moment they're in quite comfortable positions and that independence is quite daunting. If you look at the figures and the fiscal deficit, etc., in Scotland, it would really be quite a harsh time for the Scottish population if independence was granted, particularly now after Brexit. So my point there is that for socialists, we're out to advance demands that strengthen the working class, strengthen the socialist consciousness of the working class, strengthen the social weight of the working class. And the demand for Scottish independence goes in the exact opposite direction. It doesn't increase class consciousness. It doesn't increase the weight of the working class in British society. It tends to fracture the working class in British society. And therefore, we should pose as an alternative the need for workers' unity to fight the Johnson government and any other capitalist government that comes forward, rather than to go along with the Scottish bosses and the Scottish capitalist class in promoting the snake oil delusion of Scottish independence, advancing the interests of the working class. Even some of the left, if you look at George Caravan, who's often quoted on the left, he's ex-IMG, but he's also for years was a neoliberal. He broke from Marxism, was the deputy editor of the Herald, was a supporter of Trident, etc., etc. He said that after independence, there would be we'd need at least 5 years hard austerity to put the currency, the new Scottish currency, on a sound footing. So I think usually nationalist movements promise the moon and then deliver nothing, or worse than nothing. Here, sections of the SNP, if you tune in and speaking amongst themselves, they do accept that Scottish independence will be a difficult road in the first period. And I think that's part of the reason that Sturgeon, etc., are quite reluctant to go for Indyref 2, although people at Salmond and others are pushing for it. You know, although they also have a different position, some of them in the claim that we don't actually need another independence referendum. What we need is a Scottish election that elects a Scottish government committed to independence, and negotiations should start immediately. But from my reading, they also state after the negotiations are ended, you would still have to have a referendum. So the socialist position, I think, is quite clear. Some around journals, such as the papers like the Morning Star, have advocated not a two-question or two-option referendum, but you should also have the option of greater federalism within that. Personally, I don't think that's particularly useful demand to put forward. I think yes or no to independence is clearer. I know the CPGB have a position, and some others on the left, like the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, that a federal Britain would be the thing that we should advocate. Personally, I don't think that in any way is a step forward for the working class. I think it doesn't undermine Scottish nationalism in any way, because you're saying you want a Scottish Parliament with full powers. And also, as the problem is, I imagine you're recommending that we have an English Parliament as well. And I think the demand for an English Parliament is a even more reactionary dynamic than the demand for Scottish independence. But let me see now. I think, as I've said, I think the independence project, if you look at the polls, it is losing steam to some degree. We had a demonstration there at the weekend in Glasgow, first independence movement demonstration since the various lockdowns, and there was only 400 or 500 people on it. Now, I'm not saying that reflects the real support for independence. There's obviously still mass support, but it's not as enthusiastic and clear-sighted as it was. They're badly split, and the Salmon Alba party is an example of that split. So I think the wind's out of the sail for the independence movement. From a socialist perspective, the demand for Scottish independence comes on the back of defeats for the working class. At the high points of British working class struggle, independence was never mentioned. If you look at the general strike, 26, Scottish independence doesn't feature at all. And that's only a few years after Maclean's failed attempt to try and push a Scottish Workers' Republic position. It didn't feature at all in 26. It didn't feature at all in 45 in the advances with terms of the welfare state. And it didn't feature at all in the miners' strike in 1984-85, where no one, despite the CP being in leadership of the strike in Scotland and supporting a position of home rule, etc., no one seriously demanded or thought that the way forward in the miners' strike was for Scottish independence. It was workers' unity trying to fight for a workers' government. That was the essence of it. So my point is that when the working class moves forward in Britain, it moves forward together. It's when it's demoralised and defeated that it tends to break up into national or regional concerns, right? And obviously, as socialists, we want to advance the unity and the working class to the point that it can take power. And I think that the demand for Scottish independence cuts across that. I mean, we've got even a small example at the moment. If you look at the McVitie's factory problem in Glasgow, it's a biscuit factory employing 500. Been there for about 100 years, I think, now Turkish owned, and they're closing the plant. And the STUC, the Scottish Government, the Glasgow Council, the GMB, Unison have got together to try and promote this idea that the Scottish Government should provide money for a new factory and to try and encourage the factory owners to stay here. And that is the basis of the campaign that they're pushing. No suggestion of workers' occupation, no suggestion of trying to take the struggle to the other 4 factories in the UK owned by the same company, biscuit factories. That's not put on the table. Instead of that, we have a sort of Scotland United proposal, and there's within that, there is a bit of saltire waving, where they talk about why is it Scotland, always the factories in Scotland that close and not in England, etc. Obviously, an anti-working class position, and not a position that is going to lead to victory. And you can see repeated examples in Scotland where There's been campaigns around that type of thing, uniting the Scottish people to fight for keeping factories here, but it ends up with what the Scottish state or the Scottish government offering funding to business to stay here. And what would happen if they did? It would probably, they would then try and attempt to close one of the factories in England, and you would be in this situation again. You'd be in a position where you would be dividing the working class rather than uniting the working class in a struggle to defend all workers' standard of living. So, I mean, one of the reasons I think there's a decline in support for the SNP, and you don't hear the Indyref 2 demand so much, apart from the financial position, where just today it was announced that the Scottish deficit has doubled, and comrades will probably know through the Barnett formula, actually public spending in Scotland per head is higher than it is in England. So, that aspect of it, it's becoming much more difficult to push the illusions about Scottish independence would mean we could use the oil money, that we would all be in a better position. It's not going to happen. So that demand, I think, is losing some of its attraction to people. And the other thing is the actual record of the SNP in government is also, I mean, it's been cuts, and the National Health Service, mistake after mistake, the ferry fiascos, mistake after mistake, things like the drug deaths in Scotland, which are highest in Europe, and they're not doing anything about. You can't get treatment for people with drug addictions. It's very, very poor. The ferry fiascos as well. So there's a whole list. And then the question, the comrades might have followed it to some degree with the malicious prosecution of Duff and Phelps, etc., to do with the Rangers insolvency. And then the other thing, the jailing of Craig Murray. You have both continued attacks on working class living standards and anti-democratic measures. And I think you have to look at Craig Murray's jailing as part of that. I mean, it's certainly not a democratic party, the SNP. It's controlled by a clique of people. And it's run in a very, you can almost say Stalinist, but certainly a very anti-democratic manner. And recently you've also got, for instance, in Glasgow, we've got a SNP council who are implementing really sweeping cuts in Glasgow in terms of closing libraries, closing swimming pools, closing advice bureaus, closing the few golf courses that we've got, council golf courses where working class people could pay and go and play golf, closing them all down and putting us in a position where that is not available. And there is quite a campaign developing in Glasgow against the closures at libraries, etc. And that you can see that people are becoming disillusioned with the actual record of the SNP. The real problem we have, as we have in Britain, is that we don't have a mass socialist alternative. We did with the rise of the Corbyn movement. You started to see that potential forming, where there was a progressive alternative to the SNP that workers could look to. But as we know, the Corbyn movement has failed. Corbyn himself didn't stand up to the right. He didn't take the steps necessary to democratise the Labour Party and kick out the right wing. He really bent the knee to them. And we're now in the situation where the Corbyn movement is dissipating. And in that sense, you could say it gives strength to the Scottish nationalists, because the Scottish nationalists have risen when the working class is demoralised and defeated. And that, for any socialist support that the Scottish nationalist movement, I have to say to you, that's a strange sort of thing to account for. Why, when the working class is being defeated and demoralised, does support for nationalism grow? And when the working class is moving forward and trying to improve its life through its own actions, the support for nationalism decreases. I think that itself is a strong suggestion that Scottish nationalism is not a force that working class people can utilise to improve their standard of life. So that I think that would be position in any campaign for a referendum. Socialists would be intervening to say, yes, if the Scottish Parliament votes for it, it should take place. But we would recommend that in any referendum, you would be voting no, because we need to fight for working class unity. And Scottish independence is simply a dead end that offers working class people nothing, and therefore we should oppose that, and we shouldn't get drawn into the nationalist delusion that has been put forward from many on the left. And when you think about what strategy does the nationalist left in Scotland, or the SWP, the SSP, etc., have for the move towards socialism, they often advance a slogan for an independent socialist Scotland. But I mean, that is an absolutely unworldly, ridiculous slogan, right? There's no possibility of the working class taking power in Edinburgh and Glasgow if it's not also taking power in London and Manchester, etc. It's just completely ridiculous, the idea that the ruling class in London would simply allow the worker state in Scotland. It's nonsense, right? And when you put it in those terms, you can see it's nonsense. The only way that you would have a socialist Scotland is part of a British Revolution, and really only a British Revolution that has to be linked in to European-wide and an international movement forward with the working class. You're not going to have a Scottish Workers' Republic when the ruling class is still in power in London. It's nonsense. And I don't even think when you discuss it, they really believe it. It's a slogan that can put forward, it gives a left veneer, but there's no actual project for moving forward to workers' power. I would think that what we need, obviously we need to argue for a British-wide Socialist Party linked into a workers' international that is fighting in the interests of the working class. We have to promote rank and file activity against the trade union leadership who are holding back every struggle, allowing every struggle that takes place to be defeated. We need a new rank and file strategy that fights to link up workers, not only in Britain, but internationally, to fight against the bosses. And an interesting thing I've come across in the last period was the attempt by drivers in the UK through the use of WhatsApp and Facebook, etc., to try and organise their own action, a day of action where they go and strike, not through the unions, but a day of action to demand safer conditions, demand higher pay, etc., because the drivers are in a strong position to take action now if they can link up to do so. And obviously that would be a British-wide basis, and trying to spread to a European-wide basis, it would be nothing to do with the Scotland going it alone, etc. So that would be hopefully comrades can come in and we can have a discussion, so I won't go any longer about it. But the position in Indyref 2, yes, Scotland should have the right to declare a referendum when it wants through a vote in the Scottish Parliament, but the socialists should campaign for workers' unity, and to reject the delusion and dead end of an independent capitalist Scotland. Okay, I hope you heard that.